Now that your camera is all set up, let's take a few minutes and talk about the basic camera controls and what to do with them. So what do these symbols denote? You can see them on a dial on some cameras, within the menus in some other cameras. The MASP are the basic modes of your camera's exposure controls. M is for manual. You pick the aperture and the shutter speed. A is aperture priority. Canon people will know this as AV for aperture value. You pick the aperture. The camera will pick the corresponding shutter speed. S for shutter speed priority automatic, or Canon people will see this as a TV for time value, is again shutter priority. You pick a shutter speed. The camera will pick the corresponding aperture. P is program, where the camera picks both. You'll notice these four modes are sort of on a gray background, which means that you still have some control over the basic exposure. You could, for example, turn on the flash if you think it's too dark. You could use some exposure compensation if you wanted to. The green auto button takes all of that side control away. You can't use exposure compensation. The camera will decide for you if you should use a flash, that sort of thing. Completely automatic. You have no control. This mode is to be avoided at all costs. If you want to let the camera do the work, go ahead and use the program mode. The little picture modes are specific program modes. You see the flower for close-ups, for example, the mountains for distance pictures. The one of these that's particularly useful to me is the mountain picture because it forces the camera to focus on a distant object. So for example, if you're on a tour and you want to photograph a mountain through the bus window, it'll focus on the mountain, not the dirt on the window. That's kind of the only of these modes that's going to be useful, especially as we go through our assignments. We're going to learn how to do this instead of let the camera do it for us. So find how to change the mode on your camera. So we've been talking about apertures and shutter speeds. So let's talk a little more in depth about aperture, and we're going to spend a lot more time on this in a week or two. Aperture dictates how wide open the hole in your lens is during the exposure. It's expressed as an f-stop. And f-stops could be f2.8, f62, f16, f pretty much whatever you want it to be. It's an inverse scale, meaning a large number gives you a small hole and vice versa. So that's kind of confusing. F is short for fractional. That's why it's written as a lowercase f with a slash. The way you calculate it, if you care, is that you take the focal length of the lens, divide it by the aperture diameter, and you get the f-stop. So for example, a 50 millimeter lens with a 25 millimeter hole would be an f2 lens. Why might you want to use one particular aperture over the other? Well, big, wide, large apertures, small numbers, give you very small depth of field. So in this picture, we see the pipette thing is in focus, but she's out of focus. It's taken at f2.8. Peterson calls this a single subject aperture or subject isolating aperture. Small apertures, tiny apertures, are big numbers. Numbers like f16, f32, you could have an f64 on some lenses. Big numbers give big depth of field. Notice that not only is she in focus, but the building behind her is in focus, and the buildings behind that building are in focus. Peterson calls this a storytelling aperture. Shutter speed controls how long the shutter is open. It's typically written as a fraction of a second, sometimes as full seconds. And with most cameras, if you just see 125 on your shutter speed dial, it means that it's a 1/125th of a second. When you get to 1 full second, you'll get the little second markings. Shutter speed is all about motion. You could have subject motion, you could have camera motion. You generally want to stop the camera motion that comes from drinking too much coffee. To stop that, you can either use a fairly high shutter speed or use a tripod. As a rule of thumb, you can get sharp handheld photos at shutter speeds above 1 over the focal length of the lens. So for example, a 50 millimeter lens can be successfully handheld above about 1/60th of a second. Your mileage may vary, and this is something you really should test for yourself to find out how steady you can hold your camera. Rule of thumb number 2, if you try and handhold pretty much anything below about 1/30th of a second, it's going to be toast. It's just going to be blurry. Shorter shutter speeds stop motion. The example here was taken at 1/800th of a second, and you notice feet are moving a little bit, but the people are sharp and the motion is stopped. When we slow the shutter speed down to 2 full seconds, you don't even see some of the people who are moving faster. The ones that have paused for a second show up. And for example, if you look at the bottom of the picture, there's a couple of girls in yellow t-shirts that were just standing there, so they show up. The fixtures, the stairs, the building parts, they didn't move, so they are sharp. So long shutter speeds reveal motion. The third exposure control is ISO. It's the gain for your sensor. It's similar to film sensitivity in concept if you've ever taken a film photography class. Same number, same concept. Higher ISOs need less light to render a proper exposure. But there's a price to pay for that. They have more noise. Really high ISOs are unacceptably noisy. What's very high? It's a moving target. It depends on your camera and it depends on your taste. So if you look at these examples, on the far left, we have ISO 100 and it has virtually no noise. By ISO 3200, we're starting to see a little bit of noise in smooth areas. You see it in the red of the Coke machine. You see it in the now beige of the wall. By the time it's at ISO 100 and 2000, the noise is very noticeable every place. And I would not recommend using this kind of an ISO unless you really needed a photo at this speed. Some other controls that we'll talk about a little bit more later. You have your exposure compensation. There's a whole video on that. You have the flash button that some cameras have a built-in flash. This allows you to turn the flash on. And I assume at this point you found the file review button. It's the little triangle. So here's my walking around settings. Every time I pick up the camera, I make sure my file format is set to RAW. I set my exposure mode to A unless I know I need otherwise. I'm going to set my aperture to not quite wide open, maybe a 5.6. I'm just taking a guess at where I may be and may want to suddenly take a picture. I'm going to set a moderate ISO, maybe 400 to 800, someplace in that realm. I'm going to make sure that my exposure compensation and my flash compensation are zeroed out. I don't want to use it unless I know I need it. Again, we'll talk more later. I have my camera's autofocus set to AFC for continuous, and I make sure that my lens autofocus is turned to A. Some camera lenses have the ability to turn off the autofocus on the lens as well as on the camera. If you're using a checkout camera, this is one to really watch because a lot of video people like to use manual focus. I'll make sure I've reformatted my card before I go out. I really don't like running out of film. Things that I do periodically, clean the lens, seems kind of obvious to me. If I'm working with two cameras, which is a professional I do from time to time, I'll make sure that once in a while, I will synchronize the time and date settings on them so that as I switch between cameras, my group of pictures flows sort of smoothly through the day. Twice a year, I need to go in and just check and make sure I've got my camera set to either daylight standard time or daylight saving time. And that's a run through the basics. Call me if you have questions.